I never imagined it would end like this. When Lisa passed away 6 months ago, I thought my world had crumbled. We had been married for nearly 20 years, and despite the ups and downs, she was my rock. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize something unsettling. I wasn't just mourning my wife's death, I was mourning the life I thought we had. Her death left me hollow, but in that emptiness, a new relationship had taken root. Janet was the opposite of Lisa in every way. Where Lisa was calm and reserved, Janet was fiery and adventurous. We met at a grief support group, of all places, and what started as a shared sorrow quickly blossomed into something more. I wasn't proud of how fast I moved on, but I justified it by telling myself that I deserved happiness after all the pain. Lisa would have wanted that, wouldn't she? At least that's what I told myself on the nights when guilt gnawed at my conscience. When Janet suggested we visit the notary to formalize the inheritance, I was hesitant at first. Lisa had always been meticulous about our finances, but I never paid much attention. She handled everything, from paying the bills to managing our investments. I was content to let her, assuming that everything would be in order when the time came. And now that it had, I was nervous, but Janet's confidence bolstered me. "We'll get through this together," she said, squeezing my hand as we walked up the steps to the notary's office in downtown Charlotte. The old brick building had an imposing presence, with ivy crawling up its walls, as if trying to escape from the secrets buried within. The notary, Mr. Whittaker, was a man in his 60s, with thinning white hair and a pair of round glasses that sat precariously on the bridge of his nose. He greeted us with a firm handshake, though his eyes lingered on Janet a bit too long. I tried to ignore the way he looked at her. There was something unsettling in his gaze, as if he knew more than he let on. "Mr. Matthews, please have a seat," he said, motioning us to the chairs in front of his large oak desk. The room smelled faintly of old leather and the mustiness of paper that had been locked away for too long. "I've reviewed Mrs. Matthews' will, and I'm ready to proceed with the formalities." My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him pull out a thick envelope from a drawer. He opened it with a practiced motion, removing a stack of documents and spreading them out on the desk. "As you may know, Mrs. Matthews was very thorough in her planning," he began, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. "Her will was updated about a year ago, just after her illness was diagnosed." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. Lisa had been diagnosed with breast cancer the previous year, and though she fought valiantly, the disease took her from me far too soon. I tried to focus on Mr. Whittaker's words, but all I could think about was how different my life had become since then. "She made some significant changes in her last revision," he continued, his voice steady but with an undertone that I couldn't quite place. "As her surviving spouse, you would typically be the primary beneficiary. However, Mrs. Matthews left specific instructions that alter the usual course." I glanced at Janet, who gave me a reassuring nod. But something in the notary's tone made my stomach churn. "The bulk of the estate," Mr. Whittaker said, pausing as he turned a page, "has been left to a trust. The instructions are clear that the trust is to be managed by a third party, with the funds being distributed to various charities and causes that Mrs. Matthews supported during her lifetime." I stared at him, not comprehending. "But what about the house? The savings? Everything?" "The house," Mr. Whittaker said, flipping through the pages, "has been donated to a foundation that provides housing for women recovering from illness. As for the savings and investments, they have all been redirected to the trust." My mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Lisa had left me with nothing? "What about me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Whittaker looked at me sympathetically. "Mrs. Matthews left you a small stipend, enough to cover living expenses for a few months. But after that..." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Janet, sitting beside me, had gone pale. I could feel her hand trembling in mine, and suddenly, the future we had envisioned together seemed to slip through our fingers. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. But as I sat there in that stuffy office, reality came crashing down around me. Lisa had planned everything, down to the last detail, ensuring that her legacy would live on through her charitable work, even if it meant leaving me out in the cold. And for the first time since her death, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I had never really known my wife at all. We walked out of Mr. Whittaker's office in stunned silence. The afternoon sun beat down on us, but the warmth did nothing to thaw the coldness that had settled in my chest. Janet was the first to speak, her voice trembling with disbelief. "What are we going to do, Mike?" she asked, her eyes wide with panic. "She left us nothing. How could she do this to you, to us?" I didn't have an answer. All I could do was shake my head, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Lisa had always been a generous person, but this felt like a betrayal. I had spent years building a life with her, and now it seemed she had planned to erase me from it entirely. "We'll figure something out," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. The truth was, I didn't know what to do. Our future, the one Janet and I had been so sure of, was suddenly a distant, unreachable dream. As we drove back to my house, no, Lisa's house, I realized my mind raced with questions. Had Lisa known about Janet? Is that why she did this? The guilt that I had pushed aside for months came rushing back with a vengeance. If she had known, she must have been devastated. But why didn't she say anything? Why didn't she confront me? When we got to the house, I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Instead, I sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet neighborhood that had once felt so safe, so secure. Janet sat beside me, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of the mess I was in. Maybe we could challenge the will, Janet suggested after a while. There must be something we can do. Maybe Lisa wasn't in her right mind when she made those changes. We could argue that in court. I turned to look at her, seeing the desperation in her eyes. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. Lisa had been in control, right up until the end. This wasn't some hasty decision made out of spite or anger. This was deliberate. She knew exactly what she was doing, I said quietly. She wanted to make sure I was punished. "But you don't deserve this," Janet exclaimed, her voice rising. "You were a good husband, Mike. You took care of her, loved her, and now she's just going to take everything away from you." Her words hung in the air between us, but they didn't bring the comfort she intended. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I did deserve this. Maybe this was Lisa's way of forcing me to face the truth about who I had become. "I don't know, Janet," I said, rubbing my face with my hands. "I don't know what to think anymore." She was silent for a moment, then she reached out and took my hand in hers. "We'll get through this," she said softly. "We have to." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that we could just pick up the pieces and move on. But as the reality of my situation began to sink in, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end for us too. That night, after Janet had gone to bed, I found myself wandering through the house, the memories of my life with Lisa flooding back with each step. The framed photographs on the walls, the books on the shelves, even the worn spot on the carpet where she used to sit and read, it was all still here, frozen in time. And yet, it felt like a museum, a tribute to a life that no longer existed. I ended up in the study, where Lisa had spent countless hours working on her charity projects and managing our finances. The desk was neat, just as she had always kept it, with everything in its place. I sat down in her chair, feeling the weight of her absence more acutely than ever before. I opened the top drawer, half expecting to find some clue, some explanation for why she had done this. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual office supplies, papers, and a small locked box that I had never seen before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I rummaged through the desk until I found the key, tucked away in a hidden compartment. My hands trembled as I unlocked the box, half hoping and half dreading what I might find inside. What I found were letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to me, written in Lisa's neat, precise handwriting. The first one was dated nearly a year ago, just after she was diagnosed. I unfolded it carefully, my heart pounding in my chest as I began to read. Dear Mike, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. I'm writing these letters because there are things I need to say, things I couldn't say while I was alive. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was holding. Lisa had left me a part of herself, a piece of her soul in these letters, and with each word I read, the guilt that had been gnawing at me since that day in the notary's office began to swell into something unbearable. In those letters, Lisa spoke of her fears, her regrets, and most of all, her love for me. But as I continued to read, I discovered something that shook me to my core. She knew. She had known about Janet all along. She had known, and yet, she never confronted me. Instead, she poured her heart out in these letters, trying to make sense of the betrayal while still holding on to the love she had for me. And now, sitting in that empty study, surrounded by her words, I realized that the punishment I was so sure she had intended for me wasn't punishment at all. It was a gift. A final act of love from a woman who had given me everything, even when I didn't deserve it. But as I sat there, reading those letters into the early hours of the morning, I couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to make things right. The sun was rising by the time I finished the last letter. My eyes were sore from reading, but I felt a strange sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in months. Lisa's words had forced me to confront the truth about myself, about our marriage, and about the choices I had made since her death. The letters revealed a side of Lisa I had never truly appreciated: her strength, her forgiveness, and her deep understanding of who I was, even when I had been too blind to see it myself. She had known about Janet, but she never let on. Instead, she chose to pour her energy into something positive, something that would outlast her and, in some way, redeem the pain she must have felt. As I sat in that chair, the weight of everything finally settled on my shoulders. Lisa's death, my betrayal, and now this inheritance that wasn't really an inheritance at all. It was all connected. She hadn't just left me with nothing, she had left me with the responsibility to do something better with my life, to find meaning in the chaos I had created. But I didn't know if I was strong enough to do that. I didn't know if I could walk away from the mess I had made and start over. And most of all, I didn't know if Janet was part of that future or just another chapter in the story that was rapidly coming to an end. When Janet woke up later that morning, I was still in the study, surrounded by Lisa's letters. She walked in, her face pale and tired, and for a moment we just looked at each other, the weight of the situation heavy in the air between us. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice soft, almost pleading. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I handed her the letters, watching as her expression changed from confusion to realization as she flipped through them. "She knew," I said quietly. "She knew about us." Janet's hands trembled as she held the letters, and she didn't say anything. "No," I said, shaking my head. "She never did." Janet sat down across from me, her eyes searching mine for some kind of reassurance, but I didn't have any to give. All I had were questions about our relationship, about what I really wanted, and about whether I could ever truly move on from what I had done. "She loved you," Mike, Janet said after a long silence. "Despite everything, she still loved you." I nodded, feeling the familiar sting of guilt. "I know, and I loved her too, in my own way. But I didn't deserve her." Janet looked away, her expression unreadable. "So what now? What happens to us?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know, Janet. I need time to figure things out. To figure out who I am without her." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with tears. "I understand. But Mike, I need you to know something. I didn't come into your life to cause you pain. I care about you, and I thought we could build something together." Her words were sincere, and I knew she meant them. But the problem wasn't with Janet. It was with me. I had rushed into this relationship, trying to fill the void Lisa had left behind, without ever really dealing with my grief or the guilt that had been festering inside me. "I care about you too, Janet," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But right now, I'm not sure I even know who I am anymore. I need to take some time to figure that out." to figure out what Lisa wanted me to do with what she left behind. She nodded again, this time more slowly, as if accepting the inevitable. "I'll give you the space you need, Mike, but please don't shut me out completely." "I won't, I promise," though I wasn't entirely sure if I could keep that promise. I just need some time to think, to process everything. We spent the rest of the morning in a kind of uneasy silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Janet decided to give me the space I had asked for. She packed a small bag and kissed me on the cheek before she left, her eyes lingering on mine, as if she was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. "Call me when you're ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will," I replied, watching as she walked out the door. As the sound of her car faded into the distance, I was left alone in the house, my house, though it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like Lisa's house, filled with her presence, her memories, and her final wishes. And for the first time, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just walk away from this. I couldn't just forget everything Lisa had written in those letters and pretend like nothing had changed. She had left me with a purpose, and I had to honor that, no matter how difficult it might be. So I made a decision. I would start by reaching out to the charities and foundations that Lisa had supported. I would learn more about the work she had dedicated herself to, the causes she had cared about, and see if I could find some way to contribute, to make a difference in the way she had wanted. Maybe it was too late to make things right with Lisa, but it wasn't too late to make things right with myself. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, I could find a way to forgive myself for everything that had happened. With that thought in mind, I began making phone calls, arranging meetings, and slowly, carefully, taking the first steps on a path that I hoped would lead me toward redemption. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I threw myself into the work Lisa had left behind, diving headfirst into the causes she had championed. It was strange at first to be so involved in something that had once been her passion, but the more I learned, the more I understood why she cared so deeply. Lisa had always been a quiet force of nature. She didn't talk much about the work she did, but her actions spoke louder than words ever could. The housing foundation she had supported, the cancer research fund she had donated to, the local community center she had helped build, all of it was a testament to the woman she was. And now it was my responsibility to carry on her legacy. I met with the directors of the organization she had left her estate to, learning about their missions and how the funds would be used. They were surprised at first to see me so involved, but I think they could sense that I wasn't there out of obligation. I was there because I needed to be. Because in a way, it was the only way I could stay connected to Lisa. As I immersed myself in the work, I began to see the impact Lisa had made on the lives of so many people. The foundation that provided housing for women recovering from illness was thriving, and the community center was a beacon of hope for the kids in the neighborhood. It was humbling to realize that Lisa had accomplished so much, quietly and without fanfare, while I had been wrapped up in my own life, oblivious to the depth of her commitment. But as much as I found solace in the work, it didn't make everything right. The guilt still lingered, and the loneliness was a constant companion. I hadn't heard from Janet since the day she left, and I hadn't reached out to her either. I wasn't ready to face her, or the reality of what our relationship had become. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I found myself back in the study, staring at the letters Lisa had written. I had read them all, but there was one that I kept coming back to, a letter that spoke of forgiveness, not just for me, but for herself. In the letter, Lisa had written about her fears of leaving me alone, about how she had struggled with the knowledge of my infidelity. But what struck me most was her admission that she, too, had made mistakes. She wasn't perfect, and she didn't expect me to be either. She had chosen to forgive me, and she hoped that, in time, I could forgive myself. Her words were like a balm to my soul, soothing the wounds that had festered for so long. But they also forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. I couldn't move forward until I made amends, not just with Lisa's memory, but with Janet as well. I picked up the phone and dialed Janet's number, my heart pounding as I waited for her to answer. When she did, her voice was hesitant, unsure. "Mike," she said, as if she wasn't sure it was really me. "Yeah, it's me," I replied, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. "I'm sorry it took me so long to call." There was a pause, and I could hear the sound of her breathing, steady and controlled. "I wasn't sure if you would," she said finally. "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. "But I've been doing a lot of thinking. A lot of soul searching, I guess. And I realized that I can't move forward until I've made things right between us." "Are you saying goodbye?" Janet asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think I'm saying that I need to make peace with everything that's happened. With Lisa, with myself, and with you. I don't know what that means for us, but I do know that I can't keep running from it." Janet was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more resigned. "I've been doing some thinking too, Mike, and I've realized that I can't be with someone who's still haunted by the past. I care about you, but you need to let go of Lisa before you can move on. And maybe that's something you need to do on your own." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I knew she was right. I had been holding on to Lisa, trying to atone for my mistakes, but in doing so, I had been keeping myself from truly moving forward. "I understand," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry, Janet. I'm sorry for everything." She sighed, a sad, tired sound. "Don't be sorry, Mike. Just find a way to be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you." We said our goodbyes, and when I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't the ending I had envisioned, but it was the ending that made the most sense. Janet had been a part of my journey, but now it was time for me to continue on my own. As the days turned into weeks, I kept myself busy with the work Lisa had started. I threw myself into the projects, not as a way to escape, but as a way to honor her memory and, in a way, to honor the man she had believed I could be. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a museum and more like a home, a place where I could find peace, even in the absence of those I had lost. One day, while visiting the community center Lisa had supported, I met a young woman named Emily. She was volunteering there, helping kids with their homework and organizing activities. She had a bright smile and a kind heart, and something about her reminded me of Lisa, her quiet strength, her dedication to helping others. We struck up a conversation, and as we talked, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Emily was different from Lisa, different from Janet, but in her, I saw a chance for something new. Something that wasn't tied to the past, but rooted in the present, with the potential for a future. As I got to know Emily, I realized that the road to redemption wasn't about erasing the past or forgetting those I had loved. It was about accepting the mistakes I had made, learning from them, and moving forward with a new sense of purpose. And as I stood in that community center, surrounded by the laughter of children and the warmth of new beginnings, I knew that I was finally ready to let go of the past and embrace whatever the future might hold. Months passed, and life slowly began to take on a new rhythm. I continued my work with Lisa's charities, becoming more involved in the day-to-day operations and even starting a few initiatives of my own. The more I invested myself in the causes she cared about, the more I felt like I was finally honoring her memory in a way that mattered. But it wasn't just about the work. Over time, my relationship with Emily deepened. She was a breath of fresh air, optimistic and full of life, but also grounded in a way that I hadn't expected. We spent more time together, initially under the guise of working on projects at the community center, but it quickly became more than that. One evening, after we had finished a long day of organizing a fundraiser, Emily and I found ourselves sitting on a bench outside the center, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was warm, with the faint scent of blooming flowers drifting on the breeze. "This place means a lot to you, doesn't it?" Emily asked, her voice soft. I nodded, taking in the familiar surroundings. "It does. It's where I feel closest to Lisa, where I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Emily was quiet for a moment, then she turned to face me, her expression thoughtful. "I know Lisa was important to you, and I can see how much you're doing to keep her memory alive. But Mike, you're allowed to live your own life too. You're allowed to be happy." Her words hung in the air between us, and I felt a surge of emotion that I hadn't expected. For so long, I had been driven by guilt, by a need to make amends, that I hadn't allowed myself to think about what I wanted, about what my life could look like moving forward. "Emily," I started, but she held up a hand to stop me. "You don't have to explain," she said gently. "I just want you to know that I'm here, and I care about you, not just because of the work you're doing or the person you were with Lisa, but because of who you are now, the man you're becoming." Her words were a revelation, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future, a future that wasn't overshadowed by the past, but illuminated by the possibilities of what could be. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I spent more time together outside of work. We went for long walks in the park, had dinners at small, cozy restaurants, and shared stories about our lives. She told me about her dreams of starting her own nonprofit someday, and I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't with anyone else. It wasn't long before I realized that what I felt for Emily was different from anything I had experienced before. It wasn't just a distraction or a way to fill the void that Lisa's death had left behind. It was real, and it was something that I wanted to nurture, to see where it could lead. One evening, after we had spent the day volunteering together, I invited Emily over to my house for dinner. It was the first time she had been there, and as I led her through the rooms, I felt a sense of pride not just in the house itself, but in the life I was beginning to build within it. "This place is beautiful, Mike," she said, as we settled into the living room with glasses of wine. "You've done an amazing job of making it feel like a home." I smiled, looking around at the familiar space. It wasn't easy at first. It felt like a museum for a long time, like I was living in someone else's life. But now it feels different, like it's finally my own. Emily nodded, her eyes warm as she looked at me. "I'm glad. You deserve to have a place where you can be happy, where you can start fresh." I took a deep breath, the words I had been holding back finally coming to the surface. "Emily, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened over the past year, about Lisa, about Janet, about the choices I've made. And I realized something. Lisa didn't want me to live in the past. She wanted me to find happiness again, to move forward." Emily reached out and took my hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. "And are you?" I looked into her eyes, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I think I am. And I think a big part of that is because of you." She smiled, and in that moment I knew that this was the beginning of something new. Something that wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future where I could honor Lisa's memory, while also embracing the possibilities of love and happiness that were right in front of me. That night, as we sat together in the warmth of my home, I realized that I had finally found what I had been searching for all along. Redemption wasn't about atonement or punishment. It was about finding the courage to let go of the past, to forgive myself, and to embrace the life that was still waiting for me. And as Emily and I talked late into the night, our voices mingling with the quiet hum of the city outside, I knew that I was finally ready to take that step, to start fresh, to live fully, and to love again. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I had found my way through the darkness, and now I was walking into the light toward a new beginning and toward the future I had never imagined I could have.